The first frost that winter came crawling like a sickness. By dawn it had sealed the fields in white silence, and the crows refused to fly. The sky above Missouri hung low and bruised, and every living thing, beast, bird, and man, seemed to be waiting for something that hadn't yet shown its face. The old folks said it was an omen, that when the air tasted like rust and pine smoke, when the dogs howled without reason and the church bell trembled though no hand touched it, it meant the earth was remembering, and what the earth remembers, it cannot forget. That was the winter Celia came to Callaway County. The morning she arrived, the sun was a blood smear behind the fog. The wagon that carried her groaned over frozen mud, and the wheels squealed like things alive. She sat in the back, her wrists tied in front of her, eyes fixed on the barren fields that stretched forever. The driver did not speak. He didn't have to. His whip did the talking, and the horses, black, skeletal, steaming, dragged her closer toward the house that would be her undoing. From a distance, the plantation looked asleep, its chimneys still, its windows clouded with frost. But when the wagon drew near, she saw the smoke, thin, grey, rising from the barn as if the building itself exhaled. It wasn't a working fire. It was breathing. A crow landed on the fence post and watched her with something close to human intelligence. It tilted its head once, then croaked a single sound that might have been a name. Celia. She froze. The driver didn't seem to hear. The master stood at the porch, his coat heavy with fur, his hair the color of bone. He looked her over like a man assessing cattle, pausing too long on her hands, her neck, her silence. "You'll do," he said, and the words fogged the air like a curse. When she was led inside, the floorboards moaned under her bare feet. The house smelled of oak and sweat, old whiskey, and the faintest trace of lilac. Someone had tried to cover up the rot, but decay has a way of slipping through perfume. Celia said nothing. Her tongue had learned long ago that silence was safer than truth, but as she crossed the threshold, the walls seemed to shift, breathing slow, wooden breaths, and she felt the air change. Something inside that house recognized her. That night the wind rose. It pressed against the windows like fingers, keening through the cracks, calling through the rafters. The fire in the hearth burned low, but the smoke didn't rise straight. It curled back, coiling downward as if searching for her face. She lay awake on her cot, eyes wide, heart a caged bird. From the barn outside came the sound of horses stamping, restless, uneasy. Then came another sound, soft, rhythmic, like a shovel striking earth. Thunk, thunk, thunk. She rose, wrapped herself in the thin blanket, and peered out the window. In the fields beyond the barn, the snow glowed faintly under a sickle moon, and there, half hidden among the cornstalk stumps, she saw it. A figure bent low, digging. Not a man, not entirely. The arms were too long, the movements too patient. Each time the shovel struck, a puff of frost rose, glimmering like ash. She whispered to herself, "Ain't my business," and turned away. But when she looked again, the figure was gone, and in its place only a single black feather drifted, in the wind, spinning slowly until it caught the frost and froze mid-air. By dawn, word spread that a farmhand had vanished in the night. No one mentioned the strange prints in the snow, shaped like human feet but scorched black at the heel. No one dared. The master didn't seem troubled. He drank from a silver flask, all morning, laughing too loudly at nothing, watching Celia as she carried water from the well. "You'll get used to it here," he said. His smile was a knife. She didn't answer, but when he turned away, she muttered under her breath, words her grandmother once taught her, old words from a place the ocean had tried to swallow. The wind shifted. Something in the ground stirred. That night Missouri fell still again. The air was sharp enough to draw blood. The sky was too quiet. The frost on the windows formed shapes, rings, spirals, eyes that blinked when no one looked directly. Inside, her small cabin, Celia sat by the dying fire, whispering to the embers. Her voice was low, rhythmic, like prayer or threat. And from somewhere deep below, the earth answered. It was not a voice. It was a pulse, a tremor so faint it might have been imagined. But when she placed her palm flat to the dirt floor, she felt it, the throb of something ancient, something awake. The wind outside moaned through the barn again, carrying faint laughter. The horses screamed. She shut her eyes, but the sound didn't stop. It grew, rolling, rising, filling every corner of her skull. The laughter twisted into words, words that burned her ears. The earth remembers. The fire flickered once, then went black. And in that moment of perfect darkness, she heard the floorboards whisper her name. Celia. By morning, the frost was gone. The fields steamed as if the land itself had exhaled. No one spoke of the night's noise, though every man and beast had heard it. Only the master noticed the change in her eyes, how they no longer reflected light, and when he looked to the barn, he swore he saw smoke curling up from its roof. But no one else saw it. No one ever did, until it was far too late. The wind picked up again, dragging through the valley like a sigh from some sleeping god. And as the first snow of the new year began to fall, Missouri, every field, every fence post, every frozen grave, held its breath, because somewhere in the dark heart of that land, something was stirring beneath the soil, something that remembered fire. The sun was weak the day she entered the master's house, a pale coin smothered in grey cloud. Frost clung to the porch rail like old lace, and the steps creaked under her bare soles as though the wood itself resisted her presence. The door opened without sound. Inside waited a silence so thick it seemed alive, breathing through the walls, pulsing beneath the floorboards. Every corner of the house smelled faintly of damp oak, iron, and something sweeter, something that made her throat ache. Lilac. It shouldn't have been there. Not in the dead of winter. The master led her through the parlor, where portraits of unsmiling ancestors stared down from gilded frames. Each painted face seemed to follow her as she passed, eyes like puddles of oil catching dim light. He didn't speak until they reached the hearth. "You'll work in the kitchen first," he said. His voice carried the drag of whiskey and power. "Later, when you've learned obedience, you'll tend the rooms upstairs." Celia nodded once. Her wrist still bore the rope's bite, though it had been cut loose hours ago. Freedom had a way of pretending it was near, just before it vanished again. A woman emerged from the kitchen then, older, skin like river clay, eyes sunken deep as if sleep had long abandoned her. "This one's name is Ruth," said the master. "She'll show you the work." Ruth didn't speak. She only looked Celia up and down, then turned and shuffled back through a doorway heavy with heat. When Celia followed, the air shifted from cold to suffocating warmth. The kitchen was vast, lined with copper pots that hung like dull mirrors. Steam rose from a boiling pot, ghostly and slow. Ruth gestured toward the stove. "You stir, you clean, you keep quiet. That's all keeps you alive here." Her voice cracked like old wood. Then softer, she added, "He listens through the walls." The day stretched on, slow and heavy. Celia scrubbed the blackened pot until her knuckles bled. Each scrape echoed through the kitchen, and she half imagined the sound was being counted by unseen ears. When she dared to glance toward the window, the fields outside looked lifeless, blanketed in brittle frost. But now and then, just beyond the fence, she saw movement. Something dark, too tall to be a man, swaying where the cornstalks had once been. When she blinked, it was gone. Night fell like a blade. The master's boots sounded across the floor above, measured, deliberate, circling, as though he were pacing the shape of a trap. From time to time she heard his laughter, low, satisfied, carrying down through the beams like a warning. Ruth said nothing. She worked with her back turned, lips moving soundlessly in some prayer older than the house itself. When the clock struck 9, she placed a candle in Celia's hand. "You sleep out back," she whispered, "behind the kitchen. If you hear him coming, keep the candle lit." "Why?" Celia asked. Ruth's eyes flicked to the ceiling. "Because the dark here ain't empty." The small servant's cabin waited behind the kitchen, half buried in frost. Inside, the air was colder than the night. The walls leaned inward, warped by time and damp. She lay down on the narrow cot, clutching the candle, watching its flame tremble in the draught. Outside, the wind hissed through the cracks, carrying faint voices. She could almost make out words, drawn-out murmurs that circled her name, repeating it with a reverence that felt wrong. "Celia." She sat up. The candle guttered. From the darkness beyond the door came the sound of a hinge sighing open, slow, deliberate. Bootsteps crunched on frozen ground. The door latch shifted once, then stilled. Morning came grey and hollow. She woke to find the candle burned down to nothing but a curl of smoke. When she stepped outside, frost glimmered across the yard, and there at the threshold were footprints, large ones. But not from boots. Bare feet. The skin had scorched the frost into ash where it stepped. The day returned to its rhythm, firewood, water, ash. The master sat at the head of his long oak table, tapping his fingers against the wood, staring at her whenever she entered the room. Once he reached out and brushed a lock of hair from her shoulder. His touch was cold, but it burned. "You've got the look of something untamed," he said. "I'll see it broken soon enough." Ruth dropped her spoon. The sound echoed like a pistol shot. That evening, while the others slept, Celia knelt beside the kitchen hearth. The embers pulsed faintly, like eyes half-lidded. She whispered into them, not prayers, not curses, just names. Names she could remember from another shore, another lifetime. The coals flared once, a soft red sigh. For a moment, she thought she heard a voice answer back. A woman's voice, distant and trembling with heat. "Daughter of Ash, remember me?" Celia stumbled backward, clutching her chest. The fire settled. The voice was gone. Only the faint scent of lilac hung in the air, stronger than before. By the time the moon rose, the frost had turned to a thin mist that clung to the fields like a veil. Ruth found her standing at the back door, staring into that fog, candlelight trembling at her side. "You saw it, didn't you?" Ruth asked. Celia didn't answer. "You'll learn," Ruth said softly. "This land don't sleep. The house don't forget. And once it knows your name, it won't stop whispering it." Ruth's gaze drifted past her shoulder, toward the barn. Smoke curled faintly from the roof again, though no fire burned within. That night Celia lay awake and listened. Above her the master's footsteps. Beneath her the slow, steady heartbeat of something buried in the earth. When the wind shifted, she heard it again. The faint laugh, distant but familiar. And then from deep in the house a door opened. The candlelight flickered once. The scent of lilac filled the room. Celia turned toward the sound and saw a shadow that did not belong to her. It stretched long across the floor, reaching for her hand. Before she could move, it touched her wrist, cold as iron, soft as breath. And the flame went out. The night came heavy and wet, a sky thick with ink and silence. No wind, no moon, just the weight of the land breathing slow under a crust of frost. The dogs refused to bark. The roosters never stirred. It was the kind of night when even the stars hid their faces, and from the barn the sound began again, a slow, patient thudding, like a heart too large for the body that held it. Then the soft hiss of hay shifting where nothing moved. Celia lay awake in her narrow bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. Each sound seemed to pulse through the floorboards, through her ribs, into her blood. She thought of Ruth's warning. He listens through the walls. But this wasn't him. This was something older, hungrier. By dawn, she could smell it, smoke, faint and sweet, drifting from the direction of the barn. She stepped outside barefoot, the frost biting at her feet, and followed the scent across the yard. The mist clung to the ground, thin as breath, and through it the barn loomed like a sleeping beast, its roof sagging, its timbers blackened from years of rot and firelight. The great doors stood ajar. One hinge groaned softly, like a throat clearing itself. She paused at the threshold. The air inside was warmer than it should have been, wet, alive. "Ruth?" she called. Her voice fell dead against the wood. Only the horses answered, stamping, restless, eyes rolling white in their sockets. They watched her as if begging her not to enter. Inside, the lanterns flickered, though none were lit. Their glass mouths shimmered faintly, catching invisible flame. She took one step forward. The hay smelled strange, burnt and yet untouched. Every step she took sank deeper, softer, until the floor seemed to pulse beneath her soles. A whisper came from above. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. Celia. She looked up. Nothing but rafters and cobwebs. But one of the ropes hanging from the beam was swaying, back and forth, though no draft stirred. Her throat tightened. She reached for the rope. It was warm. The moment her fingers brushed it, a voice filled the barn, low, thick, dragging through the air like smoke. "He came here before you did." Celia stumbled backward, heart pounding. The horses shrieked. Their eyes turned black, swallowing the lantern light, as if night itself had taken root inside them. She turned to run, and froze. At the far end of the barn, by the empty stall, stood the outline of a man. Or what used to be one, his shoulders slumped like wet cloth, his head tilted to one side, broken at an impossible angle, and from the hollow where his mouth should have been, smoke poured in thin ribbons, crawling across the floor toward her feet. She could not scream. The sound caught in her throat like ash. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the figure was gone. Only the smell remained. Burnt flesh and lilac. When Celia staggered back into the daylight, the mist had thickened. The farmhouse windows watched her like eyes. From the kitchen doorway, Ruth stood waiting, a rag clutched in her hands. "You went inside," Ruth said flatly. Celia tried to speak, but no words came. Ruth crossed herself, not the way the preacher taught, but with her thumb pressed to her forehead, her lips, her chest. "The barn don't sleep," she said. "It remembers." "You stirred it. What is it?" Celia whispered. Ruth's face broke just for a second. "Something he brought here. Something that feeds on what's been done." That night no one went near the barn. Even the master stayed indoors, pacing the floorboards with a bottle in hand. Celia could hear him through the walls, muttering her name, half drunk, half crazed. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard him whisper, "You think I don't know what you are?" His laughter crawled through the beams, followed by a sound like a man choking. Then silence. The wind shifted. Outside, the barn doors creaked open on their own. Ruth found her again before dawn. Her face was grey, eyes red from sleeplessness. "He'll come for you soon," she said. "Maybe tonight. Maybe next. When he does, run for the barn," Celia frowned. "The barn!" "The living can't follow you where the dead are awake." Then Ruth pressed something small into her hand, a charm made of knotted twine and bone. "Keep this close. It ain't for protection. It's for remembrance." That evening the sky bled red as rust. The smell of rain never came, though thunder grumbled far away. The master's boots echoed across the porch as he left the house, heading toward the barn with a lantern swinging in his hand. Celia watched from her cabin window, the charm clutched tight. The light from his lantern moved like a golden serpent through the dark. Then it stopped. The barn doors groaned shut behind him. For a moment, only a moment, silence. Then came the scream. It wasn't the scream of a man in pain. It was the sound of something being claimed. The light from the lantern burst through the cracks, red, then white, then black. Smoke poured out from beneath the doors, thick and sweet. Celia ran into the yard, calling his name once, though she didn't know why. The barn shuddered. The horses inside wailed. And then quiet. The only sound left was the soft flutter of feathers. Celia looked down. The ground around her was covered in them. Black feathers, each one smouldering at the edges. She reached for one, and it burned her fingers. From the darkness of the barn, a voice whispered, low, close, inside her ear, though no one stood behind her. "You're next to wake." She turned toward the sound, her pulse trembling. The barn doors creaked once more, and from the thin crack between them, a faint light glowed like a single watching eye. Then the wind rose, sharp and sudden, carrying the scent of lilac through the air. It coiled around her throat, gentle, suffocating, familiar, and in the distance the church bell began to toll, though no one was there to ring it. The night came heavy and strange, thick with mist and the smell of rain that would not fall. The air pressed close around the house, humming faintly, as if the land itself was holding its breath again. Inside, the candles had burned low. Their light crawled across the walls in thin, shaking ribbons, making the shadows look alive. Celia sat by the window, unmoving, her reflection pale and hollow in the glass. Somewhere outside, the barn sighed, its beams creaking in slow, uneasy rhythm, like lungs drawing their last breath. And then, from upstairs, came the sound she had learned to fear most, the dragging step of boots across the floorboards, slow, measured, searching. The footsteps paused, then started again, down the staircase this time. Each board moaned beneath his weight, and the sound carried through the stillness like a heartbeat she could not silence. Ruth stirred from her cot across the room. Her eyes opened, wide and wet, reflecting the faint flame of the candle. "He's coming," she whispered. Celia didn't answer. Her hands clenched around the charm Ruth had given her, the twine cutting into her palm until she felt the warm bloom of blood beneath her skin. The latch on the cabin door shivered once. Then softly it turned. The door opened and he stood framed in the pale moonlight. The master. His face was flushed with drink, his hair in wild disarray. In one hand, a lantern flickered, spilling orange light across his coat. In the other, a silver-tipped cane that struck the floor with a sharp, deliberate click. He smiled, but it was not a human smile. It was the grin of someone who believed the world belonged to him and that even the dark owed him obedience. "You think you can hide from me down here?" he said softly, his voice dragging through the air like wet cloth. Celia did not move. The candlelight trembled between them, and for a moment she thought she saw something move behind him, an outline in the mist, tall and wrong. Ruth rose, her voice shaking. "Sir, please, the girl—" He silenced her with a single look. "Back to bed, Ruth," he said almost gently. "This is my house." "My word." Ruth's lips moved in prayer, but she obeyed. The master turned back to Celia. "You've been avoiding your duties," he said. "You've been whispering things that don't belong in a Christian tongue." He stepped closer. The flame in his lantern guttered. Somewhere outside, the horses screamed. When he reached for her, Celia's breath caught. Not from fear, something colder, older, coiled inside her now. The scent of lilac filled the room. The floor beneath her feet pulsed once, as if the ground itself had taken a breath. The master froze. What is that smell?" he muttered. His hand wavered in the air, fingers trembling. The lantern's light shifted, painting his face in red and gold. His eyes widened, as though he finally saw the shape standing between them. Not Ruth, not Celia, but something else. A figure faint and shimmering, standing in the corner where the shadows pooled deepest. It was shaped like a woman, her form built of smoke and cinders, her hair drifting like embers in unseen wind. The master's voice broke. "Who's there?" No one answered, but the figure lifted its head, and in the hollow where a face should have been, the light burned white-hot. The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed the room and the smell of oil filled the air. Celia didn't move. She felt the heat rise around her, soft at first, then swelling, an unseen fire licking at the walls, whispering through the boards. The master stumbled backward, coughing. The floor beneath him groaned, the wood blackening where his boots struck. "Witch!" he gasped. "You witch, what have you done?" Celia's voice came low, calm, older than her years. "I ain't done nothing." The house just remembers. The wind outside rose in a howl. The windows rattled in their frames, and from the direction of the barn came the deep, guttural moan of wood twisting under heat. The master lunged toward her, but the air between them shimmered, and a streak of flame burst up the wall beside him. The light caught his sleeve, briefly, just a flicker, but it spread fast, as if the fire had been waiting for permission. He screamed, batting at the flames, stumbling backward into the doorframe. Ruth cried out, clutching her cross, her prayers tumbling into the air, useless and broken. Celia stood still, her eyes fixed on him, her shadow growing long across the floor. The charm in her hand had burned to ash. The fire climbed higher. The room filled with smoke, thick and sweet, that same impossible scent of lilac. He stumbled toward the open door, coughing, choking on his own fear. Outside, the mist had turned gold with the reflection of the fire rising in the distance, the barn awake again, burning without flame. Celia followed him out into the yard. Her breath came steady, cold, controlled. She watched as he staggered toward the barn, screaming for help that would never come. The doors swung open for him, wide, inviting, waiting. From inside came a sound like the slow intake of a giant breath. He crossed the threshold and vanished into the dark. For a moment, there was silence. Then a roar. Fire burst through the cracks of the barn like light through a wound. The air trembled, and every tree on the property bowed toward it, their branches clawing the sky. Ruth fell to her knees, crying out. Celia stood unmoving, the fire reflected in her eyes, and from within the burning barn came a voice, not a man's, not any more. "Celia, remember me." The barn blazed brighter, but the flames gave no heat, only light. And in that light, the shape of the master flickered once, twice, then disappeared entirely, consumed not by fire, but by something deeper. When it was over, the wind died. The night was silent again. Celia turned toward the house. The frost on the ground had melted in a perfect circle around her feet. She whispered to no one, her voice barely a breath. "It's done." But the barn behind her gave a single groan, deep and shuddering. A final exhale, and from the ashes rose the faintest trail of smoke, curling upward, forming the shape of a hand, pointing toward the town. Morning came like a wounded thing. The fields were grey and still, and the air tasted of salt and soot. Where the barn had once stood, there was now only a hollow, black and silent, the earth beneath it charred to glass. Smoke still clung to the trees, thin as spider silk. It hung in the branches like a ghost reluctant to leave. No birds sang. Even the wind seemed afraid to touch the ruins. Celia stood at the edge of it all, her dress torn, her face ash-marked and calm. Behind her, Ruth hovered in the doorway of the cabin, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes wide and glistening. "Child," she whispered, "what did you do?" Celia didn't answer. She only stared at the ruin before her, the place where screams had turned into silence, and felt the weight of something watching from beneath the earth. By noon, word had spread through the fields. Overseers came, then townsfolk, then a sheriff with a heavy mustache and colder eyes. They stood in a line, staring at what the night had made. One of them spat. "Lord Almighty," he muttered. "Ain't seen a fire like this in all my days." Another crossed himself. "No smell of kerosene," he said quietly. "No embers, neither, just gone." The sheriff bent down, gloved hand brushing over the ground. The soil was smooth as stone, black and shining. In its reflection, he thought, just for a moment, he saw a face looking back. A woman's face, smiling. He pulled his hand away. "Get the preacher," he said, "and the undertaker. What's left of him's in there somewhere." But when they searched, they found nothing. No bones, no teeth. No ashes, nothing human. That night the townspeople whispered of it. They said the barn hadn't burned at all. It had vanished. That the flames were cold, that the smoke had carried his soul away. Some said they saw her standing there in the firelight, untouched. Others said she wasn't standing, she was floating. The preacher called it witchcraft. The sheriff called it murder. But the old women in town, the ones who remembered the stories their mothers told, called it reckoning. 3 days later the fields began to rot. The corn curled in on itself. The livestock refused to eat, and every morning the sky turned a strange color, half pink, half gray, like a bruise spreading across heaven's skin. Ruth tried to pray, but the words came out wrong. At night, she heard the master's voice in the rafters, whispering her name with a cough of smoke. Celia didn't sleep at all. She sat by the window, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes the glass fogged, not from her breath but from something on the other side of it, something trying to come through. One evening a boy from the next farm came running, panting, wild-eyed. He said the river had turned black. He said the master's hounds were howling in the woods again, though they'd been buried behind the barn weeks before. Celia listened in silence. When he finished, she said only, "They ain't howlin'. They callin' him home." Ruth grew pale. She tried to make Celia leave. "We can go north, child, away from this cursed soil." But Celia only shook her head. "It's done," she said softly. "Ain't no north for me." That night she went to the edge of the field. The wind was still. The world seemed to hold its breath again. She knelt where the barn had once been. Her fingers traced the blackened soil, the faint warmth that still pulsed beneath it. And when she whispered the master's name, the ground answered. A deep hum, low and steady, rolled up through the earth. The air thickened, and the scent of lilac, his favorite, rose around her once more. The sheriff came at dawn with his men. They found her standing there, barefoot, her face turned toward the rising sun. Behind her, the earth smoked again. He dismounted, hand resting on his pistol. "Celia," he said slowly, "you know why we're here." She looked at him, her eyes hollow but steady. "I reckon I do." He shifted uncomfortably. "Where's the body?" She smiled faintly. "Ask the wind," he frowned. "You think this is a game?" "No," she said. "It's a debt." When they tried to shackle her, the chains burned cold against her skin. One man dropped them with a cry. The iron scalded his hands, leaving white scars shaped like fingers. The sheriff cursed, spitting tobacco. "Devil's work," he hissed. "Maybe," she murmured. "But the devil don't burn barns for justice. They took her anyway." But as they led her away, the wind rose sharp and fierce, and every man felt it. A whisper curling past his ear, a woman's breath cold as frost. "What the fire took, it will take again." That night, the black soil of the barn began to crack. From the fissures seeped a faint red glow like embers breathing underground, and the smell of lilac rolled once more through the town, sweet and wrong, curling through windows, under doors, into dreams. Children woke screaming, claiming they saw a man made of smoke standing by their beds. In the morning, their pillows were dusted with ash. By the end of the week, no one dared speak the name Celia aloud. The fields were empty, the house boarded. But when the wind passed through the hollow, it carried her voice, low, endless, and unbroken. He burned first, but I burned last. No one remembered when sleep left Missouri. It slipped away sometime after the fire, carried off on the wind that smelled of lilac and ruin. The townspeople closed their shutters, but still the smoke came, thin, pale threads that wove through cracks and keyholes, curling into dreams that were not their own. In those dreams the barn burned again and again, but the man inside it no longer screamed. He laughed. By the seventh night, the preacher ordered every church bell to ring at dusk. He said the sound of heaven would drive out the ghosts of the damned. But when the bells tolled, they didn't echo right, they dragged as if struck underwater, and each note carried the faintest undertone of a woman humming. The sheriff sat on his porch that evening, watching the smoke drift from his pipe. He had the papers ready, the indictment, the testimony, the sentence already written in ink black as the soil from the barn. But he couldn't bring himself to sign. The pen trembled in his hand, not from guilt, but from the cold that had begun to seep up from the floorboards. He could feel it breathing. Celia was held in a small stone jail behind the courthouse, a place that smelled of rust and damp. The iron bars were new, forged quick in fear. Ruth came once, bringing bread that she'd blessed with trembling hands. "Don't speak to me," Celia whispered through the bars. "They listen." Ruth looked around, confused. "Who listens, child?" "The walls." Ruth stared, wide-eyed. "Walls can't hear." Celia smiled, slow and small. "These ones do. They remember every cry that's ever been swallowed in here. When the trial began, the whole town came. Farmers, housewives, children clutching their mothers' skirts, all crowded into the courthouse, drawn by the kind of curiosity that smells like fear. The windows were open to the January wind, yet the air inside stayed stiflingly warm. The judge took his seat, the gavel heavy in his hand. "Celia of Callaway County," he began, "you stand accused of murder by fire." A murmur passed through the crowd, soft, nervous, like leaves stirring before a storm. The sheriff shifted uneasily, hat pressed to his chest. "Do you confess?" the judge asked. Celia looked up, eyes steady. "I confess to surviving." A ripple of unease. The judge frowned. "That's not the question before this court. It's the only one that matters." Outside, the wind rose. The church bells began to toll, though no hand pulled their ropes. Each peal rolled through the courthouse like thunder, and with every note the lamps flickered lower. The preacher stood, sweat running down his temple. "This is a court of God," he cried. "And she's brought the devil with her." Celia's voice came calm, almost gentle. "Devil? We don't come to places already claimed." The crowd gasped. The air grew thick. A faint hiss came from the hearth in the corner, though no fire burned there. Someone whispered that they smelled lilac again. Someone else swore they heard a heartbeat in the floorboards. The judge slammed the gavel. "Enough of this. She'll hang for what she's done." At that moment the gavel struck once, and the echo did not fade. It multiplied. One strike became 2, then 4, then dozens, rolling through the courthouse like drums beneath the earth. Each thud came slower, deeper, as though the soil itself were answering. The walls began to darken, not with shadow, but with soot. Tiny flakes of ash drifted down from the ceiling, settling on shoulders, on tongues, on the indictment paper itself. The sheriff looked to the window. Outside, the sky was red, not sunset, but something burning beyond the horizon. "God help us," he murmured. Celia closed her eyes. He tried. When the final bell tolled, every lamp in the courthouse went out. Darkness fell like a curtain. In the pitch black, the crowd heard only the sound of crackling, soft at first, then rising like 1,000 tiny breaths catching flame. Someone screamed. Someone prayed. And through it all a woman's voice whispered, close to every ear at once, "What you judge, you join." The doors burst open, wind howling through, carrying the smell of smoke and the faint rustle of something feathered. When the lamps were relit minutes later, Celia still sat in her chair, chains cold against her wrists. but the floor beneath her was scorched in the shape of wings. That night the judge found his pen lying in ashes on his desk. The preacher lost his voice before dawn, and the sheriff, who had seen the reflection in the black soil, dreamed of a woman made of smoke standing in his field, eyes glowing red, whispering from behind a veil of flame. "You buried him once. Now you'll bury yourselves." When he woke, his hands were black with soot, and outside his window the church bell began to ring again, slow, unsteady, tolling for no one and for everyone. The morning of the sentencing dawned pale and shivering, as though the sun itself feared to rise. A grey mist clung to the streets, swallowing sound and shape alike. By the time the courthouse bell tolled, most of Missouri was already gathered, hats in hand, breaths ghosting into the cold air. They came not for justice, but to see whether God still ruled this place. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wet ash and old sweat. The judge sat rigid at his bench, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He'd tried to rehearse the words of the verdict, but every time he reached the name Celia, the paper blackened beneath his hand. She sat alone at the table, wrists bound in iron that had turned the color of frost, her gaze fixed on nothing, yet every flicker of her eyes made the candles waver. The preacher muttered prayers that tripped over themselves. The sheriff's jaw worked like a man chewing guilt. The townsfolk kept their distance, clutching charms and crosses that suddenly felt light as paper. The judge struck the gavel once. The sound barely carried. It fell into the mist like a stone into deep water. "Celia of Callaway County," he rasped. "This court finds you guilty." A whisper interrupted him. It came from nowhere, yet from everywhere at once, thin as breath on glass. Guilty of what? The crowd stiffened. The whisper came again, nearer this time. Of fire, of fear, of remembering. The judge froze, gavel halfway lifted. Who spoke? No one answered. But from the rafters came the soft creak of wood expanding in heat. A witness rose, a farmhand, trembling hat crushed in his hands. He spoke of the night of the fire, of light brighter than dawn and screams that sounded not human. But as he spoke, a faint glow began to shimmer beneath his boots. "Sir," the judge interrupted, "step away from the floor." The man looked down. Where his shadow fell, the boards were blackening, curling at the edges like parchment held to a flame. He stumbled back, crossing himself. "I ain't staying here," he whispered, and fled. The doors swung shut behind him on their own. Celia lifted her head. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was softer than the wind through dry grass. "Your court's built on graves," she said. "You can't try the dead." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The preacher pointed a shaking hand. "You confess to witchcraft, then?" She smiled faintly. "No, I confess to justice." The judge slammed the gavel again, but the blow made no sound. The gavel had turned to coal in his grip. Outside, thunder rolled through. No storm showed in the sky. Windows rattled, shutters banged, and the smell of lilac crept once more through the cracks. The courthouse lamps dimmed until only her face remained visible, her eyes reflecting the faint red glow now seeping from beneath the floor. The preacher fell to his knees. "Lord, deliver us." And Celia whispered, "He already tried." "You buried him too." Then the doors burst open. A gust of smoke flooded in, thick, heavy, carrying the sound of a single heartbeat that filled the room. The crowd scattered, but there was nowhere to run. Through the haze, shapes moved, shadows of the men who'd once lived on that land, the master among them. Their faces flickered in and out of the smoke, like memories trying to breathe. "Do you see them?" Celia murmured. "That's your jury now." The judge tried to speak, but his voice caught. Behind him, the portraits of governors and generals hanging on the wall began to peel, their paint bubbling, their eyes turning to black smears. The sheriff was the last to stand his ground. He drew his pistol, though his hands trembled. "And this woman?" She looked at him sadly. "You can't shoot what's already burned." He fired once. The bullet struck the wall behind her, and hissed, turning to ash before it fell. The sound it made was like breath leaving a body. By the time the smoke cleared, the benches were empty. The townsfolk fled into the mist, screaming that judgment had turned on them. Only the judge, the preacher, the sheriff, and Celia remained. The preacher clutched his Bible to his chest. "What are you?" Celia stood slowly. Her chains fell away, soundless. "I'm what your prayers made when they went unanswered." The church bell began to ring again, though the tower stood miles away. Each toll came slower than the last. until finally there was only silence. The judge tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick with ash. The sheriff fell to his knees, staring at the floor. Where Celia had sat, the wood was burned through, a perfect circle of char. Beneath it, deep, far beneath, they thought they heard faint crackling, as if something vast and patient waited below, still feeding. And on the judge's verdict paper, though no hand touched it, 3 words appeared in soot-dark script: "The trial continues." By morning, the courthouse was gone. Only a crater remained, and the smell of pine and lilac twisting together on the wind. And somewhere in the fog, a woman's voice whispered, steady as a tolling bell, "Justice don't die. It just changes shape." The gallows rose before dawn, built in silence plank by plank, as if the town feared to wake the sky. By morning the frost lay thick over everything, the rope stiff as bone, the beam blackened by cold. They said it was the first clear day since the fire. But the light felt wrong, thin, metallic, sharp enough to draw blood. The people came in their Sunday clothes, clutching prayer books like shields. The preacher stood near the platform, voice cracked from sleepless nights. The judge beside him wore a new coat, though his hands shook inside it. The sheriff didn't speak at all. He only watched the horizon, where the mist hung low, curling like smoke that refused to rise. And when Celia was brought forth, chains loose around her wrists, the crowd went still. She looked smaller than they remembered. Or maybe it was the world around her that had grown large and hollow, as if emptied out by what had come before. The preacher tried to speak first. He called her child once, then stopped himself, realizing the word no longer fit. Whatever stood before them now was older than any child, older even than the field that had burned. He cleared his throat. "Celia of Missouri," he said, "you stand condemned to death by hanging." Celia tilted her head. "By whose hands?" The preacher hesitated. "By the law." Her smile came slow, sorrowful. Law burned with him. A whisper rolled through the crowd, soft, uneasy. Above them, the bell tower loomed silent. At the stroke of noon, the first toll came. It was not struck by any hand. The sound rolled out heavy, low, a groan that seemed to come from the ground itself. The horses reared, the women clutched their children, and a flock of blackbirds took flight from the church roof, spiraling high into the pale sky. The sheriff looked up, hat pressed to his chest. He felt it again, the cold breath moving beneath the boards, as though something ancient waited below, listening. Celia stepped forward on her own. No one dared touch her. Her bare feet left faint prints of ash across the snow, and with every step the air warmed. By the time she reached the platform, frost had melted into mist around her. The executioner trembled. He'd tied 100 ropes before, but never one that felt alive in his hands. It pulsed once, faintly, as he placed it around her neck. Celia's gaze turned toward the horizon. "Endings," she whispered, "don't come with ropes. They come with fire." The preacher raised his hand. "May God forgive you." She met his eyes. "May he forgive you for watching." He flinched. Somewhere deep in the crowd, a child began to cry. The sheriff gave the signal. The lever fell, but the sound was not that of a body dropping. It was of wood splintering. The beam cracked clean through, falling like a felled tree. The rope snapped free, burning at the ends as though lit from within. The crowd screamed. Celia lay on the ground, unbroken, the rope coiled beside her like a serpent reduced to ash. She rose slowly, eyes glowing faintly. Not with fire, but with light the color of dawn seen through smoke. The preacher stumbled back. Devil's trick. The bell tolled again. This time it rang 13 times. Each note struck deeper, darker, until the sound became something more like breathing. The air shimmered. The mist rolled thick, and through it came the faint scent of pine and lilac once more, sweeter now as if purified by flame. Celia turned to the crowd. Her voice carried easily, calm and low. "You built this gallows on his grave." No one answered. The wind did instead, howling, circling, picking up cinders from nowhere. Celia raised her hands. "They wanted a body. Let them have his." The ground split open. From the earth rose a column of smoke, twisting into the vague, screaming shape of a man aflame. The crowd fled, prayers dissolving into sobs. The judge dropped to his knees, whispering for mercy. The sheriff stared into the fire and saw his own reflection staring back. When the smoke cleared, Celia was gone. Only the gallows remained, half-burned, swaying softly in a wind no one could feel. The rope was still there, though frayed and blackened. At its end hung not a body, but a length of charred wood shaped like a man's hand. The bell rang once more, though faintly now as if from far away, and in that dying note, the town realized the truth. The execution had not been an ending, only a passing of something through her, into the world itself. That night the frost returned. It coated every roof and window with a strange pattern, spirals of ash and feathers. Those who looked closely swore they saw a face hidden within the ice, a woman's face, eyes closed, waiting. The fire was 20 winters gone, yet no man in Callaway County slept easy on New Year's Eve. Every December, when the frost thickened and the wind turned sharp enough to bleed, they said her name again, Celia, softly, fearfully, never after midnight, because if you spoke it when the year was dying, the bell might toll again, and when it tolled, something in the dark would listen. The town rebuilt, of course. They always do. The barn was ploughed under, the gallows torn down, and the fields sown with corn and wheat. But nothing ever grew straight there. The stalks twisted as they rose, their roots black and brittle as bone. When the harvest moon shone on them, you could swear the field breathed, slowly, like something sleeping just beneath the soil. By the 15th year, children played a cruel game. They'd dare one another to walk out to the old field at dusk, carrying a candle and whispering Celia's name 3 times. Most came back laughing, pale and trembling. Some didn't. The sheriff, now grey, half-blind, and drinking himself toward the grave, swore that every name lost in that field was one of the men who'd built the gallows. He'd wake screaming at night, the smell of lilac and smoke filling his room. His last words, muttered to an empty chair, were, "She ain't done yet. They say the curse changed form over time." No longer fire but fever, no longer rope but silence. Crops rotted overnight. Cows birthed still calves with soot in their mouths. Church bells cracked from inside out. And every New Year's Eve, when the frost turned white as bone, the same thing happened. At midnight, a barn somewhere would catch fire, without match, without lightning, without reason. And in the morning, when the smoke cleared, they'd find the walls unburned, but the ground beneath them black as tar. In 1893, a preacher's wife heard the bell again. She woke to it tolling softly in the distance, though the church had been empty for years. When she opened her window, she saw a woman standing in the snow, barefoot, still, watching. Her dress was grey as ash, her hair a spill of shadow against the white world. The woman lifted her hand once, just once, then vanished. By dawn, the preacher's barn was gone. His house untouched, his faith not so lucky. By the turn of the century, they stopped calling it a haunting. They called it the New Year's curse, a thing born not from evil, but from balance, a debt the land itself demanded be paid again and again, until memory rotted into myth. Parents told their children, don't light candles on New Year's Eve, don't stand near barns after midnight, and never ever speak her name when the frost breathes on the window. But children grow and disbelief grows with them. And every generation one forgets. One laughs at the warnings. One says the name. Those who live long enough to remember tell the same story. When the clock strikes 12, a wind rises. It carries the smell of lilac and pine, thick as smoke. The air glows faintly, like embers buried under snow. Then they hear it. One low toll, then 12 more. The 13th is always the quietest. It sounds less like metal and more like a voice. And when it fades, something old and cold exhales through every house, blowing out every candle in the county. Each year, a single family leaves before New Year's. They pack fast, don't speak much, and never come back. No one asks them why, because those who stay can already hear the first faint echo of the bell beneath the frost, and when it tolls again, it will not toll for the dead. It will toll for the living, for the ones who forgot that fire has memory and ash remembers names. They buried her in unmarked ground, but the earth refused to close. For 100 winters frost settled heavy over that field, yet the soil beneath never froze. It steamed in the moonlight like something breathing, slow and steady, as though the world itself could not forget what it had done. No one tended the land anymore. The fences had fallen, the roads had turned to mud, and the town of Callaway had been erased from every map. But still the smoke came, always on New Year's Eve, always from nowhere. In 1925, a surveyor rode through the valley, searching for the ruins of the old courthouse. He found only a hollow in the ground where the gallows once stood, and a faint scent of lilac drifting against the wind. When he pressed his hand to the soil, it burned him. Not flame, not heat, something deeper. He swore he heard a voice whispering beneath the earth, like a woman speaking through a mouthful of ashes. He left that same night, his maps unfinished. The next spring, the field bloomed with black roses that no one had planted. Decades passed. The world changed, forgot, rebuilt. Electric light came, and with it a new kind of night. Bright, humming, merciless. But the curse doesn't care for time. It only listens for the tolling of the bell. And in 1999, when the last new year of the century rolled in, a storm like no other swept across Missouri. Barns burned again, 12 of them in 12 towns. No lightning, no arson, only silence before the flames. When the clock struck midnight, a 13th blaze appeared. No one saw who lit it. But witnesses spoke of a figure walking barefoot through the snow, her dress trailing fire that didn't melt the frost. She turned once toward the churchyard, and every bell in the county rang on its own. The fire that night didn't stop at Barnes. It crawled through the fields, the roads, the very roots of the land, but it burned nothing living. Only the forgotten. It found the ruins of the old gallows and burned them to air. It found the master's grave, no marker, no mercy, and left behind a hollow, black and deep as a wound. By morning, when the ash had cooled, a single thing remained in the center of the field, a small clay figure, shaped like a woman holding a flame in her hands. It was warm to the touch, and when the sheriff lifted it, the fire inside its chest flickered once as if breathing. Years later, they built a highway over that place. Cars rush across it now, their tires hissing over the buried bones of the past. But some nights drivers swear they see a light in the rearview mirror, a woman walking in the distance, wrapped in smoke. When they slow down, she vanishes. When they speed up, she keeps pace beside them. And if they stop entirely, the engine dies. The air smells of pine and lilac, and the frost on the windshield spells a single word: remember. Now the story is told as a warning, passed through whispers, through sermons, through cracked lips on cold nights, that fire cannot be owned, that a soul wronged cannot be buried, that every new year the world owes its due. So if you ever find yourself driving through Missouri when the bells begin to toll, pull over, turn off the lights, and listen. Because beneath the hum of the wind and the snow and the engines, you might hear the faint crackle of embers, not burning, just waiting. And if you hear a woman's voice say your name through the smoke, do not answer. She's not calling for you, not yet.